All right, let's see how to find the domain of functions. So we stated that the domain is, let's say, just to refresh, domain is, first set or input value, or sometimes we call it or independent variable. In this case, for example, if you look at the first example, this is the input value. So what is the possible input values for this p of x is equal to 2x minus 4? So whatever value you plug in, the function is defined. In this case, we said that the domain is defined without any restriction. So the interval notation for the domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity. That means you can input any x values into p of x, and the function is defined for all real numbers. The second one, however, if you look at the second one, you can look at here, right, this one, x cube, right? Now, if you remember on the discussion of algebra, 8 over 0 is undefined, right? You can't define. So anything on the denominator should be different from 0. If you just plug in 0, for example, for this function, let's say f of 0 is 2 minus 8 over 0 cube, which is undefined. You can get a value. So the interpretation is the domain is generally this function is satisfied for all real number x such that x should be different from 0. But how can we write this one in terms of interval notation? So in order to represent interval notation, let us visualize in terms of graph. Look at this graph, but it is not defined at x is equal to 0, but it is defined for any real number except 0. So interval notation, we can write from negative infinity, 0 union, from 0 to positive infinity. So this function is not defined at x is equal to 0, but it is defined for all real numbers. So the interval notation is written as from negative infinity to 0, union 0 to infinity. I will recommend you to draw the graph until you understand how to define the domain of a given function. So let's add more example. Let's discuss. For example, let's say this example. Find the domain of f of x is 5 minus x. Remember that any root function, square root function, the inside, must be greater than 0. For example, if you have negative 1, it is undefined under the set of real number. Remember, negative 2, undefined, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, any expression inside the square root must be greater than or equal to 0. Now, do the inequality, subtract negative 5 both sides, so minus x greater than or equal to negative 5. Please, when you do interval inequality, make sure that when you just divide by negative 1, the sign will be swiped. That is x less than or equal to 5. In other words, the interval notation, like I said, x less than 5 means start from somewhere 5 to the left, which is negative infinity. So the interval notation is written as from negative infinity 5 inclusive. This is a interval notation. Let me add one example. For example, f of x is x plus 2 divided by x plus 3. Now, when you look at rational function, look at the denominator. That means any expression on the denominator should be different from 0. That means x says that x plus 3 should be different from 0. So this is the statement, or this is equivalent to x says that x should be different from negative 3. Now, this is the statement, but most of the questions you are asked is to write in terms of interval notation. In order to write in terms of interval notation, first visualize. I'll recommend this one. For example, draw a line. This function is not defined, but it is defined for any values from negative infinity to negative 3 and to the right side. So interval notation for this from negative infinity, negative 3, use union from negative 3 to infinity. That is the interval notation. In the question, you will be asked to specify your domain in terms of interval notation. Let's add one more example. Find the domain of, for example, f of x is 4x to the fourth minus 4x squared plus 5. When you look at this one, it is a polynomial function. We call it a polynomial function of degree 4. Any polynomial function is defined for all real numbers. For any values of x, the function is defined for polynomial function. So just this one is the domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity. Thank you.